Alright guys, in front of you I have an SPSS data set. This was originally a Stata formatted data set, but it's been saved as SPSS. It's Latino Barometer data from 2016. The Latino Barometer looks at a lot of countries, but this particular data set only has Canadian respondents. In this screencast, what we're going to do is talk about how you get a data set ready for analysis by perhaps selecting only the number of variables that you want to analyze, but also how you remove observations that have no relevance at all to your research and that would complicate any statistics that you would compute. And the most common way that this becomes a problem is when you've got a data set that has, say, 20 countries in them and you only want to look at respondents from 2 or 3. So you've got to remove all of those other countries. So let's get going by opening up the data set in SPSS. And I use multiple data sets, so I'm not going to click on it. I'm going to actually pick the program. And everything looks good. Our data set has, let's see, 95 variables, 94 variables, and if we go to data view, which tells us the number of observations, and we look at that, we can see that there were 1,511 Canadians in this. I know that's right just from looking at the data. So our data set looks like it's ready to go, so let's get started. We don't have a syntax file yet, and we're going to go ahead and create one automatically in the first step. We've got our original data, and what I want to do is create a syntax file that will tell us in the future to open up our data and then to save it as a working file. So the first thing that I'm going to do is say open data, and if it didn't take me to the right place immediately, I'd use this folder up here to get me back up to my O drive and into, in my case, the SPSS sample file that I've got in my O drive, which is where the original data is. So first thing I want to do is tell SPSS in syntax to open up this data file. I don't have a syntax file already open, but because I'm going to tell it to paste, it will go ahead and create one for me. And there we go. I've got my syntax file. I haven't saved that yet, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. And because it's Canadian data, I'm going to do Canada and Latino Barometer in 2016, just to remind myself what the date is. So I've went ahead and saved that syntax file. Alright, so I can run this. I'm not going to, but if I ran this, it would tell SPSS to go get this data set and open it, but it's already open, so I don't need to do that. But what I do want to do is I want to quickly, if I can, tell SPSS that I don't want to analyze all 50 variables anytime that I'm looking at stuff. It would be a lot easier for me if I could just identify the variables that I'm going to have in my data set, just to speed things along, so that I'm not continuously having on every screen that I look at a choice of 40 variables. So to do that, I'm going to want to save this file, this big file, as a much smaller working file that eliminates most of the variables and keeps only those that I need. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to File. Whoops, if I do that in my syntax, it'll save my file. So because of the data set, or for the data set, I want to go over here and I want it to save my data file as not the original, because I'm going to change the data set, so I want this to be my working file. And I'm just going to tell it to save it, and I hit paste because I'm going to change this code. Remember, anytime we're working with data and changing the data set, we want to paste rather than save. And so I go ahead and do that. And if I go back to my syntax file, it now says get the original file and save it as a different file working. But here's the trick. I don't just want to save it, I want to save it minus a lot of the variables. So what I'm going to do is tell it to keep certain variables. And having looked at this data set earlier, I am particularly interested in looking at the relationship between gender and some other variables, but gender and support for coups. So I am going to go ahead and find Q1, which is the gender variable, cut and paste it so I don't have any typos, and tell SPSS through /keep equals to keep that variable as one that I thought was important. And there's also a couple of coup questions that I think are kind of interesting. So let's find those quickly. Coup is justified when crime is high. That's JC10. I can tell that JC13 looks exactly the same in terms of format, so I'm going to do this and do this. And I've now told SPSS to save an out file as a working file that just has these 3 variables. If I go ahead and run that, nothing happens at all. You don't see any flip in the screen because all it's done is save the file. If I want to look at that file, I'm going to have to tell SPSS to open the new file that I've looked at. And so if I do this, I go to Open, Data, that working file. Whoops, I double-clicked on it so it shows it to me, and sure enough, it's working. I made a mistake there. What I should have done is gone File, Open, Data, got to that, selected Working, and then I've got to paste my file so that in the future, when I run SPSS, it will run the file that I want, save the working file, and then go ahead and save it with just the variables that I want. So one of the things that I had gone over in class was sometimes we not only want to truncate the number of variables we're looking at before we begin to analyze the data, but we also want to delete certain observations. And the easiest way to do that is to go over back to the data again, and it's to go to Data, Select Cases, which means Select Observation. In this case, just showing you something very quickly, when Canadians were asked what, well, let's go to the smaller data. Well, we can do this. Descriptive statistics, frequencies. When Canadians were asked about their gender, 8 respondents declined to give one gender or the other. And it might be that what the study that we're looking at is going to have analyses only as men, only about men with respect to support for coups, and only about women with support for coups. And rather than treating this as missing data, in the example that I'm giving, we're going to go ahead and remove these observations from the sample so that we only have people who self-declared as men and female. And in order to do that, we go back to Data, and we go to Select Cases, and we're going to select cases and put them in only if they satisfy certain conditions. And in this case, it was if your gender, and again, I can do this, or I can just do Q1, because that's what the variable is, equals 1, which was if you were a male, or if you said you're a female, then we're going to go ahead and keep you in the observations that we're going to analyze. And so we hit Continue. If you were not selected under those conditions, we're going to go ahead and remove those cases from the analysis. So I go ahead and hit Paste, and it will put it into the syntax. So now my syntax has get the original file, save the out file with only a handful of cases, get that working file, then with that working file, I want you to go ahead and only keep cases where we have men or women. And finally, we need to save that file, so we're going to go ahead and run everything up to there. And then we've got my 3 observations. And the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to save that data. And we're going to save over the top. We're going to save the working file. We hit Paste. And there we go. Now we've got a data set that does everything that we've asked. It gets our original data set. It saves only a handful of variables. It opens that variable data set back up. Then it drops the observations. Then it saves the out file as working. And if we do that, our future data set will be all ready to work with so that we're looking only at the observations and only at the variables that we care about. And so we select all of our code to make sure that we've done it right, and we run it, and lo and behold, we have our truncated data set. We ran the analyze on gender, and we're going to find, just taking a look at it, that all of our respondents who did not identify a gender have been dropped. And that, my friends, is how we grab an SPSS data set and we create the data set that we want to use for the rest of our coding. The next logical step, once we had done this, would be to begin the process of recoding individual variables. The good news is from here on out you can just work with your working file because this is the data set that you're going to need. The other important point is the whole reason why we did this process was if it turned out that later on you needed to add additional variables to the data set, you know, there were too many or there weren't enough variables in it, you needed to look at other things. You still have the original data set, which I just had up there flashed for a second, and you've got the syntax. And what you can do is you can go back and you can add additional variables if you need them, and then just rerun the code, and it will, as I'm going to do right here, it's just going to recreate a new working data set right there. So that's the what we covered in class today, and I hope that this is helpful if you need a resource. Just let me know if you have any questions. All right, bye-bye.